The cameras flicker to life, the studio lights glaring like a stage built for battle. And there she is, Kellyanne Conway, once the fierce mouthpiece of an administration built on defiance, now leaning forward across the polished table. Her face tightens, her voice rises, and then it breaks into a scream so sharp that it cuts through the air like glass shattering. Every syllable drips with fury, as though volume itself could overpower truth. Across from her, Jasmine Crockett does not move. Not a twitch. Not a flinch. She sits anchored in her chair, her body language a portrait of composure in the middle of Conway's storm. Her eyes are steady, her lips pressed into a thin, knowing line. It is the contrast that seizes the viewer, one figure unraveling in real time, the other sitting in silence, radiating the kind of calm that cannot be bought, cannot be faked. The host looks rattled, darting glances from one guest to the other, as though unsure whether to intervene or let the fire rage. Viewers at home lean forward instinctively, compelled by the rawness of the moment. And still Conway shouts, each word louder than the last, each accusation hurled like a weapon designed to wound. Her finger jabs the air, her eyes blazing, her voice climbing to a register that feels less like debate and more like desperation. And yet, Jasmine doesn't break. She inhales once, slowly, as though drawing power from the stillness around her. The corners of her mouth lift, just barely, signaling not arrogance but certainty. This is the calm before a storm of a different kind, not thunderous, but surgical. Not rage, but truth. What happens next will soon dominate timelines across the country. Clips will be shared, captions will flood social feeds, and strangers will type with fire in their fingertips about the poise of a woman who refused to scream back. But in this frozen instant, in the seconds where Conway's scream hangs in the air, echoing against the studio walls, no one yet knows how it ends. Because this isn't just noise. It isn't just a viral clip. This is the opening act of a clash that will reveal something far larger, a reckoning with power, arrogance, and the quiet dignity that refuses to be drowned out. And what comes next will leave the nation holding its breath. The broadcast wasn't meant to be fireworks. At least, not on paper. The network had billed it as a straightforward roundtable, a spirited discussion about policy, culture, and the fractures running through America. But behind the cameras, producers knew what they were really engineering: friction. They'd invited Kellyanne Conway, a figure who had spent years weaponizing outrage, sitting opposite Jasmine Crockett, a rising congresswoman known for her sharp mind and her refusal to bow under pressure. It was national television, the kind that carries weight not just in ratings, but in how the country digests its reflection. Millions of viewers tuned in, some to cheer, others to jeer, but all aware that sparks were inevitable. And in that setup, the symbolism was undeniable, one woman representing a legacy of spin, aggression, and combative politics, the other standing as a new voice, one rooted in lived experience, dignity, and the quiet fire of justice. Kellyanne knew the game. She had played it for years. Shout the loudest, control the narrative, make truth bend until it snapped. For her, this wasn't just a debate, it was survival, an opportunity to remind America she could still dominate a screen. She leaned into that instinct from the first minute, interrupting, talking over, framing her opponent not as an equal but as an intrusion. Jasmine, by contrast, entered with the weight of something larger on her shoulders. She wasn't just speaking for herself, she was speaking for communities often dismissed, for women of color who had seen their dignity stripped by louder voices, for anyone who had ever been told they didn't belong at the table. For her, silence was not weakness. Patience was not passivity. They were choices, deliberate ones, waiting for the right moment to strike with clarity instead of chaos. The studio audience felt the tension immediately. You could see it in the nervous laughter, the sharp intakes of breath when Conway cut across lines of civility, the way Crockett's refusal to break composure became almost unsettling in its power. This wasn't just a panel discussion anymore. It was theater, and more than that, it was a test. What was being tested wasn't just policies or talking points. It was respect itself. Could arrogance still bully its way to dominance in front of millions? Or had the moment shifted? Was America ready to see dignity triumph over disdain? Producers backstage exchanged glances as Conway's volume rose. Social media teams already had their fingers hovering, sensing the kind of content that would ignite platforms. Viewers at home shifted in their seats, leaning closer, sensing something volatile building beneath the surface. And then it happened. Conway, unable to break Crockett's composure, made a choice. She crossed the invisible line, the one between heated debate and outright meltdown. Her words grew sharper, her tone more desperate, until it was no longer about arguments at all, but about unleashing raw, unchecked anger. It was the moment that would replay millions of times, clipped and shared, dissected and memed. A single decision to scream her way forward, unaware that on the other side of that eruption sat someone who had been waiting, patiently, for the perfect moment to respond. And what came next would turn this clash from a fleeting TV spat into something unforgettable. Before she was a guest on this broadcast, before her voice cracked through microphones with the force of a whip, Kellyanne Conway had already carved out her place in American political theater. To her supporters, she was brilliant, a strategist who could turn a losing campaign into a cultural war cry. To her detractors, she was the embodiment of spin itself, a woman who could turn lies into slogans and confusion into control. Either way, she was unforgettable. Her notoriety began long before the night of the scream. As Donald Trump's campaign manager, Conway became the first woman to steer a presidential campaign to victory. History-making, yes, but the story didn't stop there. What defined her wasn't just the win, but how she wielded language afterward. Phrases like alternative facts entered the national bloodstream, proof of how she could bend words until they seemed to serve an entirely new reality. For her, truth was less an anchor and more a canvas, something to be painted, repainted, and sold with a straight face to the American public. It was a skill honed over decades. She had been a pollster, a commentator, a strategist, but above all, she was a survivor. Washington was not a city that rewarded timidity, and Conway never had an ounce of it. She knew how to seize the camera, how to command attention, how to dominate a narrative by sheer force of confidence. She became a fixture of television panels, a regular sparring partner for anchors who learned the hard way that a question posed to Kellyanne often came back as a counterpunch. But survival has its price. For years, her sharp tongue, once considered an asset, morphed into a liability. Where others saw composure and logic, Conway offered combat and deflection. It made her effective in the short term, yes, but it left cracks that widened whenever someone refused to play her game. For those who met her volume with silence, who countered her fury with facts, Kellyanne's armor became less impenetrable and more brittle. She was never more at home than in chaos. If the room was tense, if tempers were flaring, if rules were breaking, she thrived. The louder, the better. The messier, the safer. Because in that mess, she could always dominate. For years, it worked. For years, she thrived on being the loudest voice in the room, as though decibels themselves were a measure of victory. But arrogance is a dangerous ally. And on this night, across from Jasmine Crockett, arrogance disguised itself as instinct. Conway believed volume would win again, believed that intensity could silence calm. What she didn't recognize was that Crockett was not playing her game. There was no attempt to shout over her, no scramble to interrupt. Instead, Crockett's stillness became a mirror, reflecting Conway's unraveling back to the audience. And the more Conway raised her voice, the more obvious the imbalance became. It wasn't just a clash of personalities, it was a living contrast between two visions of power, one rooted in domination, the other in dignity. By the time Conway hit her highest pitch, the strategy she had used for years was collapsing. What once made her feared now made her mocked. The loudest voice in the room was no longer commanding, it was flailing. The skill that had carried her through Washington's cutthroat arenas was, in this studio, turning against her. And for the first time, Conway found herself on the wrong side of a dynamic she had always controlled. Because across from her sat someone who knew that silence, wielded wisely, can be sharper than any scream. Long before Jasmine Crockett sat under the unforgiving glare of studio lights, she had learned what it meant to hold her ground. Her story didn't begin on a polished set or in the halls of Congress. It began in courtrooms, in neighborhoods overlooked by power, in communities where voices were too often dismissed until someone like her stepped in to fight. Jasmine's path was never the easy one. Born into a working-class family, she grew up watching the struggles of ordinary people, the kind who worked 2 jobs and still worried about bills, the kind who believed in the promise of America even when that promise felt distant. She carried those stories with her, letting them fuel her determination as she pursued law. For Jasmine, becoming an attorney wasn't about prestige. It was about defense. About standing in the gap when others couldn't. Her legal career reflected that mission. She didn't chase glamour cases. She took the ones that mattered to the people who had nowhere else to turn, cases involving housing disputes, wrongful arrests, workers fighting for dignity. Every time she walked into a courtroom, she wasn't just representing a client. She was standing for something larger, the belief that justice wasn't reserved for the privileged. Justice had to belong to everyone. It wasn't easy work. She faced hostility, dismissiveness, the subtle and not-so-subtle barriers that come with being a black woman in rooms where power had long been guarded by others. But Jasmine never cracked. She responded with persistence, with facts, with composure that rattled those who expected her to falter. Each time she won a case, each time she carved out space for dignity in places designed to crush it, she built not just a reputation, but a resilience that would serve her for years to come. Her transition into politics was natural, almost inevitable. The courtroom gave her one arena to fight, but public office gave her a megaphone. Elected to Congress, she brought the same relentless energy to representing her district as she had to defending her clients. She spoke with passion but also with precision, cutting through noise with words that stuck. She became known not for theatrics, but for a composure that drew people in, a steadiness that made allies feel safe and opponents feel exposed. What made Jasmine different wasn't just what she fought for, but how she fought. She didn't mistake volume for strength. She didn't confuse showmanship for impact. Where others shouted to be heard, she chose clarity. Where others lashed out in anger, she leaned into patience. And in that patience, there was power. Supporters saw it. They flocked to her events not just to hear her policy positions, but to feel the steadiness of her presence. She radiated something that transcended politics, dignity. A reminder that strength didn't always look like dominance, sometimes it looked like calm that refused to be broken. And so, when Jasmine Crockett was invited to that television roundtable, she knew what was coming. She knew Kellyanne Conway's reputation, knew the strategy of bulldozing opponents with volume and aggression. Jasmine could have prepared by sharpening her own barbs, rehearsing zingers meant to slice back. Instead, she prepared the way she always did, by centering herself in truth, in composure, in the unshakable knowledge that chaos cannot defeat calm unless calm allows it. That preparation made all the difference. Because when Conway unleashed her scream, when she hurled her fury across the table like a storm, Crockett did not meet storm with storm. She became the eye of it, still, steady, resolute. And in that stillness was a power louder than any scream. It was that power, that deliberate refusal to rise to the bait, that would soon shift the dynamic of the entire confrontation. The nation would watch in awe not because Crockett matched Conway's volume, but because she dismantled it without raising her own. And it was that unshakable calm that would soon turn Kellyanne's roar into silence. The opening pleasantries barely had time to register before Kellyanne Conway launched her offensive. She leaned in hard, her voice sharp, her cadence quick, the familiar rhythm of someone who had spent years rehearsing verbal combat. From the first sentence, it was less a debate than an ambush. She cut across the host, dismissed questions with smirks, and zeroed in on Jasmine Crockett with the precision of someone who had chosen her target long before the cameras rolled. Her words snapped like whips. "You're out of your depth. You don't understand how Washington works." Each line layered with disdain, each syllable dripping with the same condescension that had made her infamous. The audience shifted in their seats, sensing the escalation, the temperature of the room rising as Conway's pitch climbed higher and higher. But across from her, Jasmine Crockett remained still. She didn't interrupt. She didn't flinch. She sat with the same deliberate composure she had carried into courtrooms and congressional hearings, her eyes fixed calmly on Conway, her lips closed as though she were letting the storm pass around her. That stillness, far from passive, became active. It rattled Conway, made her voice strain louder, as though silence itself were mocking her. The insults grew sharper. Conway's hand slapped against the table, the echo reverberating through the microphones. She jabbed her finger, her voice climbing into a near shout. "People like you," she began, a phrase heavy with the implication of dismissal, of othering. Viewers at home could feel the contempt dripping through their screens. And yet, Jasmine didn't budge. Her posture was unshaken, her eyes calm, her face betraying only the faintest hint of a smile, the kind that signaled not arrogance, but patience. It was the patience of someone who had seen tempers flare before, who had faced rage and contempt and chosen not to meet it in kind. The host attempted to intervene, to redirect, but Conway bulldozed ahead. Each attempt at balance was swatted aside with another insult, another rising note of fury. The air in the studio felt electric, as though every word was charging it tighter, ready to snap. And Conway thrived on that tension, or at least she thought she did. For the viewers, though, the contrast became impossible to ignore. One woman red-faced, voice cracking under the weight of her own fury. The other composed, steady, seemingly untouchable. It was a portrait of chaos versus control, arrogance versus dignity, and the imbalance was striking. By the time Conway's voice hit its peak, the spectacle had shifted. What she intended as dominance now looked desperate. Her words, meant to sting, began to sound like noise. The audience in the studio, and the millions watching from home, began waiting, not for Conway's next insult, but for Jasmine's first reply. Because the silence was no longer empty. It was loaded. It was expectant. Every passing second built suspense, turning Crockett's quiet into its own form of power. And then, at the height of Conway's fury, Jasmine moved. Slowly, deliberately, she leaned forward in her chair. The shift was slight, but it carried weight, like the opening move in a game that Conway didn't realize she was playing. The scream in the room hung for a beat longer, and then, with a calm breath, Jasmine began to speak. And everything changed. The studio seemed to freeze in the instant Jasmine Crockett leaned forward. The clamor of Conway's tirade still hung in the air, but the balance of the room had shifted. Viewers could feel it without understanding why. This wasn't just a counterargument in the making, it was a moment, heavy with anticipation, like the first drop of rain before a thunderstorm. Jasmine's lips parted, and when her voice came, it was soft, not weak, but deliberate, a measured tone that forced the room to lean in rather than recoil. "Kellyanne," she began, her words smooth as polished glass, "I've listened to you scream for several minutes now. And I think the country deserves better than noise." The effect was immediate. The studio, once filled with Conway's sharp-edged fury, dropped into silence so thick you could hear the shuffling of papers on the host's desk. Conway blinked, momentarily startled, her mouth half open as though ready to fire back, but Crockett didn't give her the space. She paused. That pause was surgical. It wasn't hesitation, it was precision, giving the audience time to absorb the rebuke, letting the weight of her words settle like dust after an explosion. Then she continued, voice steady, calm, almost soothing. "Facts matter. Respect matters. And if you think shouting over people will erase either, you're mistaken." The audience, quiet until now, murmured, a low ripple of approval that seemed to punctuate each phrase. On social media, clips of that single line were already being clipped, typed over with captions. She shut it down without raising her voice. Conway tried to interject, but the effort landed clumsy. She started, faltered, then tried again, her tone defensive now rather than dominant. It was a stark reversal, the woman who had thrived on disruption suddenly disrupted herself, tripping over her own urgency. Jasmine didn't raise her volume. She didn't need to. Instead, she layered her words like stone on stone, building a case that was less argument and more revelation. I didn't come here to trade insults. I came here to talk about solutions. You've had years in power, and the country saw what you chose to do with it. What I represent is the people who refuse to be talked over anymore. Another pause. Another silence that screamed louder than Conway ever could. By now, the host sat frozen, eyes darting back and forth as though witnessing history rather than moderating a debate. Even the cameras seemed to lock more tightly on Crockett's face, capturing the control in her expression, the poise in her delivery. And Conway? The transformation was plain. Her voice, once booming, now came in clipped bursts, strained attempts to claw back control. But every word she tried to throw was met with Crockett's calm, her sentences dismantling Conway's entire strategy. It was like watching someone swing wildly in a fight, only to be sidestepped with ease, each miss leaving them more exhausted. Jasmine's crescendo wasn't in volume, but in clarity. When you shout, you tell us more about your fear than your strength. You're afraid of being challenged. You're afraid of the truth standing next to you. But here I am, and no matter how loud you get, you can't erase me. The words landed like a gavel. In that moment, the fight was no longer about two women at a table. It was about every viewer who had ever been shouted down, every immigrant told to be quiet, every underdog dismissed as unworthy. Crockett wasn't just answering Conway, she was answering for them. The studio erupted, not in noise, but in energy. Gasps, scattered applause, murmurs of awe. The host finally broke his own stunned silence with a stammered, "Congresswoman Crockett, please, go on," as if the stage now belonged entirely to her. Meanwhile, on Twitter, the moment detonated. Hashtags spiked. Clips replayed within seconds of broadcast delay. Viewers typed frantically, "This is how you handle a bully. This is composure. This is history." The calm reply had already begun its viral ascent. And Conway? She fidgeted, shuffled papers she wasn't reading, her smile tightening into something brittle. She tried to laugh, but it came out hollow. She raised her voice again, but it no longer carried authority, it carried strain. For years, she had built her reputation on controlling the chaos. Tonight, she was the chaos, and Jasmine Crockett was the control. Crockett closed her point with finality, her voice still steady, still composed, almost gentle. America doesn't need another scream. It needs solutions. And it needs leaders who don't confuse anger with answers. The sentence lingered, echoing longer than any shout could. It was surgical, devastating, and undeniable. Her words didn't just answer Conway. They dismantled her. Piece by piece. And as the audience leaned forward, waiting for what would come next, it was clear, this was no longer Conway's stage. It belonged to Jasmine. And the aftershocks were only beginning. It didn't take hours. It didn't even take minutes. Within seconds of Jasmine Crockett's calm reply, the internet detonated. On Twitter, the clip spread like wildfire, first passed around by political junkies who live-tweeted every second of the debate, then ricocheting outward into timelines of people who hadn't even watched the broadcast. A single caption captured the mood perfectly: "This is how you silence arrogance, with calm truth." By the end of the segment, hashtags were already trending: hashtag calm versus chaos, hashtag Crockett clapback, hashtag dignity wins. The numbers climbed into the millions before the night was over. TikTok edits popped up almost instantly. One slowed the moment down in cinematic fashion, overlaying Crockett's steady words against Conway's frenzied gestures, the contrast impossible to ignore. Another added dramatic background music, turning Jasmine's measured cadence into the stuff of trailers for political blockbusters. Instagram Reels looped the exchange endlessly, the caption sections filled with fire emojis, clapping hands, and declarations of admiration. Support poured in from all sides. Progressive commentators hailed Crockett as a new voice of reason, a model for how to dismantle demagoguery without descending into it. Young activists celebrated her as proof that politics could still produce leaders who refused to be baited into the mud. Even apolitical viewers, those who typically tuned out debates as noise, admitted they felt glued to the clip, struck by the way Composure had cut sharper than any insult. Meanwhile, Kellyanne Conway became a meme. Her raised voice was clipped, remixed, exaggerated, and reimagined. Someone looped her scream over a heavy metal guitar riff. Others turned her jabbing finger into GIFs, used to mock every kind of overreaction online. The contrast was unavoidable. Jasmine's calm became an emblem of dignity, Conway's fury became a punchline. Late-night hosts wasted no time. By the next evening, monologues opened with jokes about the scream heard round the internet. One played the clip in slow motion, dubbing it the moment Kellyanne lost to silence. Another compared it to a courtroom drama flipped on its head, the witness falling apart under calm cross-examination. The studio audiences roared, feeding the cycle of laughter and validation. Celebrities chimed in. A-list actors reposted the clip with captions like, "Masterclass in Composure." Musicians quoted Jasmine's line about confusing anger with answers, turning it into lyrics that fans instantly screenshotted. Even athletes got in on it, using the clip as a metaphor for staying cool under pressure. Every repost carried Crockett's name further, elevating her from congresswoman to cultural symbol. But beyond the jokes and praise, something deeper was happening. Communities who had long felt talked over saw themselves in Jasmine's silence, and in her refusal to let that silence mean surrender. Social media threads filled with personal stories, immigrants recalling how they'd been shouted down in classrooms or workplaces, women of color describing the exhausting balance of staying composed while facing condescension, young viewers confessing that they finally felt they had a role model who didn't just clap back, but rewrote the terms of engagement. Commentators framed it as a turning point. This wasn't just a viral clip, one analyst declared. It was a cultural referendum on how we want our leaders to behave. Even some of Conway's usual allies admitted, in quieter tones, that the optics had been disastrous. Outrage as a weapon had backfired, and dignity had claimed the spotlight. The ripple effects spread beyond television. Editorial boards wrote op-eds about the power of composure in an era of noise. College debate teams dissected the moment as a study in rhetoric and restraint. Church groups, book clubs, even classrooms replayed the clip, using it as a conversation starter about conflict, respect, and leadership. What started as a TV spat had now become a cultural moment. The scream and the calm that followed weren't just entertainment, they were a mirror held up to the nation. And the reflection asked a question louder than Conway's voice ever could: what kind of power do we want to follow? In the days after the clash, the noise faded but the meaning lingered. Viewers had replayed the clip so many times that the words felt etched into the national memory. Yet what made the moment last wasn't just the spectacle of Conway unraveling, it was the clarity of what Jasmine Crockett represented. Her reply had turned into more than a comeback. It had become a lesson. Crockett herself framed it best. When asked about the exchange, she didn't gloat. She didn't dwell on Conway's loss of control or the wave of memes that had followed. Instead, she redirected the conversation. "This isn't about me versus her," she explained. "It's about how we treat one another, how we fight for what matters without losing who we are." Her words landed with the same quiet weight as they had in the studio, composed, deliberate, and bigger than the clash itself. The symbolism was undeniable. Conway's scream was volume without vision, a noise meant to dominate the room, but not to serve the people watching. Crockett's reply, in contrast, embodied patience, truth-telling, and the strength to resist being dragged into chaos. It was a reminder that leadership is not measured by how loud you can shout, but by how deeply your words can resonate when spoken with integrity. Justice was in that moment. Not the kind found in courtrooms or in legislation alone, but the justice of dignity, the idea that even when power tries to overwhelm you with volume, you can stand your ground with clarity. Self-control was in that moment, too, proof that restraint can be a weapon sharper than rage. And woven through it all was something deeply American, the belief that every voice matters, and that no scream, no matter how forceful, can erase truth spoken with calm conviction. For many, the exchange became more than entertainment, it became an allegory. Teachers used it to show students that composure outlasts insults. Parents shared it with their kids as proof that grace under pressure is not weakness, but strength. Activists pointed to it as a reminder that their dignity is their loudest tool in the face of systems that try to silence them. The crescendo of this story was not Conway's scream. It was the silence that followed, a silence Jasmine filled not with noise, but with meaning. In that silence, Crockett reminded America that dignity doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. And as the nation reflected on the clash, one truth became clear: noise fades, but dignity echoes. And so we return to the moment that sparked it all, Kellyanne Conway screaming across the table, her fury unleashed for the nation to see. But what history will remember isn't the scream. It's Jasmine Crockett's reply, calm, precise, dignified, a reply that turned chaos into clarity and left millions inspired. This clash wasn't just political theater. It was a mirror, reflecting the deeper struggle for what kind of voices we want to lift up in America. Do we reward the loudest, the most abrasive, the ones who confuse anger for strength? Or do we celebrate the steady, the truthful, the ones who understand that composure can move hearts in ways shouting never will? That's why this video matters. Because in Crockett's reply, we saw proof that dignity is not passive, it's powerful. We saw how patience can disarm arrogance, and how truth, spoken without venom, can ripple farther than rage. And now, that moment belongs to all of us. It's not just Jasmine Crockett's viral clip. It's a reminder that every one of us carries the ability to shift the tone, in our homes, our communities, our country. To rise above the scream. To speak with clarity when others shout. To let dignity echo louder than noise. If this moment moved you, if it reminded you of what leadership should look like, then join us. Subscribe. Share this story. Be part of the community that believes in calm over chaos, truth over spin, dignity over arrogance. Because in the end, this wasn't just Jasmine Crockett's viral moment. It was a reminder for all of us, that calm, truth, and dignity are louder than any scream.